lot of you know that I studied abroad last year at the University of Cape Town in South Africa for nearly 11 months. This experience, first of all, was just really fun. I got to go bungee jumping, go on multiple safaris, things I ever dreamed I would have done. But a little more importantly than that, it was a very valuable experience. And this is because every single day I was constantly challenged and thus changed. Throughout my time there, I was continually reassessing, redefining, and reevaluating what I thought I knew about myself and about the world around me. So here are some images of events that really affected me greatly. This top image is of students at a township elementary school where I would go with a lot of other students once per week to tutor. At the end of the sessions, students would come up and they would line up for apples and juice and different snacks. But at the end of every session, students kept getting in line again and again for more and more apples. And they would ask us, why do we bring such small apples? And this is because for many of these students, this was one of the only meals they would receive during the day. The photo at the bottom is of me with my soccer team. And this was a really fun experience again, but it was also great because I got to see how the world's game, something we all play throughout the world, changes depending on where you are in the world. Sometimes games were delayed because gang violence in the community was just too great of a risk for us to play there. The photo next of that cute old man is Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who won a Nobel Peace Prize for his work fighting and standing up against apartheid. My friend and I snuck into a class where he was a guest lecturer and got to hear him speak for an hour about apartheid, where South Africa is now, and where he envisions it to go in the future. And then finally, the top photo, that humble home is where Nelson Mandela lived throughout much of his life. It was really humbling and empowering to walk through the very door that Nelson Mandela walked before he was imprisoned and really stood up against apartheid. And so through all of these experiences, I was constantly gaining a new perspective as I analyzed the world around me. And then while I was abroad, Ferguson started happening. And I was on the other side of the world, just in awe of what was happening in my very own country. And as I began to analyze Ferguson and the post-apartheid South Africa around me, I began to see some really strong parallels of our history. So here we have pictures of segregated park benches. This is something we've all seen in the textbooks as we've been growing up from elementary, middle, and on to high school. And these park benches were actually in South Africa. The top one is still in downtown South Africa as a reminder of where the country was not that long ago. And so, seeing images like this, seeing Ferguson, seeing South Africa, I noticed the very strong parallels and connections between Jim Crow and apartheid. And so today, I would like to analyze apartheid and then pivot the conversation back onto ourselves to understand where we've come from, our current status in America, and what we have further to do. Because for a lot of us here, we probably recognize that we have a problem of racism in America. But some of us, whether it be blissful ignorance or of malicious intent, choose not to recognize the problem. They think, hey, we got Obama, it's all good, racism doesn't exist anymore. But that's not the case. So today, I want to dig into apartheid to pivot the conversation onto ourselves. But first, I want to start with a disclaimer. I obviously am white. I'm also from a predominantly white community. We're upper middle class, so I've come along with a lot of privilege. And I don't know what it's like to be a black person to grow up in our country, or a person of color. And I'm definitely not an expert on apartheid or racism. So for the next 10 minutes, I want to share my perspective and knowledge. And then after that, I'm going to sit back and I'm going to actively listen to people who are more qualified to lead this discussion. So, South Africa. It's at the very bottom of the African continent, and it's home to 55 million people. These people are incredibly diverse. There's 11 national languages. There's multiple races, ethnic groups. It's really an exciting country that gives the Rainbow Nation its namesake. It's also a fairly new democracy. It only became a democracy in 1994 with the first free elections of Nelson Mandela. Before that, from 1948 to 1994, South Africa was a country of apartheid. Apartheid literally means a state of being apart. It is segregation in its most ultimate form. The National Party was elected in 1948, and they implemented apartheid as a way to elevate and maintain their white culture separate from the black majority and the majority of other non-whites. And so for the first time, we had the minority of the country ruling the majority, and the majority of citizens didn't even have citizenship. And so here, one of the first acts that was enacted was the Population Registration Act of 1950. this aimed to classify every single South African citizen based upon their race, which is a pretty lofty task, and it was done with some very arbitrary language, which we can see up here. So in red, you have white people. They're obviously white. The public perception is that they're white, and they're not white. Black people are also defined as Bantu, which is a tribe, one tribe of South Africa that was then just extrapolated to all Africans in general within the country. So we just know they're black. You just look at them, you know. And then finally you have colored. And these are ethnically ambiguous people. They're not just like 50-50. Their lineage goes back hundreds of years and it's very mixed. We might call them exotic. And so they're not white, they're not black, they're just somewhere in between. And one of the ways that they helped determine race was something called the pencil test. So they put a pencil in your hair. If you were white, the pencil effortlessly fell to the ground. You were white. If you were colored, it was in there and then it eventually fell out, so you're colored. And if you were black, it would just get in there, it was stuck, and it wouldn't fall out. So these arbitrary, humiliating tests went on to have huge ramifications on the rest of your life. Some more signs that we should all be familiar with. Signs that say, whites only, no non-whites allowed. Here we have signs segregating bathrooms, water fountains, movie theaters, you name it, it was segregated. This bottom photo is actually from the Jim Crow South. So you can see, you really wouldn't know if it was Jim Crow or apartheid because there's just segregation that's imposed upon the people. And there's no way of knowing Jim Crow or apartheid because they're so similar. And apartheid was relentless. It determined everything about your life. And when the majority of people began to gain traction or display resistance, the government struck back. They used force, more laws, and began banning political organizations. A lot of these leaders ended up on Robben Island. So here, in this large photo, we have Nelson Mandela's cell. He was imprisoned here for 18 of his 27 years where he was a political prisoner for standing up to the government. For a while, he was a banned person, and he was actually caught when he was pretending to be undercover, and the police found out where he was. Every single thing a political organization did was being monitored by the government, and it was treason. Just for, rallying a few people together and having a meeting, that was considered treason. Another way that the government struck back to the communities was creating the Group Areas Act. And this decided where people were allowed to live based upon their race. Families and communities were ripped apart and forced to live in certain areas. So this is a map. It's a plan of a community. In the middle, you have the central business district. Around that, that's where white people are allowed to live. They were even separated based upon economic status, with the most affluent of white people living in the lush suburbs away from the interior. Then you have areas specifically designed for Indians, colored people, and black people. There's also buffer zones there and physical barriers. This is something that you can still see today as you drive into Cape Town. You come past the airport, and there's lots of townships and formal settlements, remnants of plans like this. You pass an industrial area, and when you come out of the other side of that barrier, there's beautiful golf courses and lush neighborhoods, and then you get into the central business district downtown. So you can still see how these plans that they made worked so well because they're still enacted all the way in 2015. And then this is one last act that I'd like to talk about, and I think it should really hit home for us because we're affiliated with the university and we really value education. So in 1953, they passed the Bantu Education Act. And here's a quote of one of the main writers of that act, who is the South African Minister of Native Affairs. It says, "The natives will be taught from childhood to realize that equality with Europeans is not for them. There is no place for the Bantu child above the level of certain forms of labor." So this means that the government decided what you were capable of and what you should learn based upon your race. So black people, obviously, they could never be more than domestic workers and laborers. So their education would cut out in middle school because they would never need anything more than that. White people, they could go on to be lawyers, doctors, work in the government, so they had access to high school and really great tertiary institutions. And another asset of this law was that all schooling had to be taught in Afrikaans, which was the language of the ruling party. So the majority of the people hated Afrikaans, and they didn't want to be subjugated once again to the ruling party within their schools. So leaders like Nelson Mandela urged students and families to boycott school and boycott apartheid, instead leaning for homeschooling and going to missionary independent schools. These photos here are of children protesting the Bantu Education Act. Some of these kids are maybe 10 years old, and they're standing up for their rights, putting liberation ahead of education. But today, South Africa is a full-fledged democracy. It has Nelson Mandela, Desmond Tutu, these great leaders and Nobel Prize winners, and it's really a great country, and you should all visit. But it still has a lot of its own issues that it needs to conquer. So here are some statistics of present-day South Africa. 25% of all adults are unemployed. 57% of people still live in poverty, with 14% still living in informal settlements like shacks. And 17% of all South Africans are affected with HIV or AIDS, and in some communities that number is as high as 40%. Some of these numbers are even kind of on the low side. Some people will argue that their numbers are even greater than this. And finally, this last number, 63.4, is a Gini coefficient. And a Gini coefficient is a quantification of income inequality within a country, with 0 being perfect equality and 1 being perfect inequality. So 63.4, South Africa has one of the highest Gini coefficients in the world. And I think this statistic is incredibly telling, because although South Africans are working together to unitedly emerge from their dark past, the worlds are still two very separate worlds. You have the upper and middle class, and then you have the black majority, and their lives are still separate and apart. And I think this is incredibly telling and what we should be focusing on. I used to think about this a lot when I was at the University of Cape Town. This is a picture of the school. It's beautiful, it's prestigious. I would be here and I would stream Game of Thrones. It's just like Case Western Reserve University. But then I would sit out on these steps, and I would take a break from my schoolwork, have lunch, and just contemplate where I was in the world. And I would look onto the Cape Flats, a sprawling neighborhood of hundreds of thousands of people, where this is oftentimes the reality. There's shacks, overflowing toilets, no electricity, and students don't go to school all the time because of gang violence, or they ask again and again for more and more apples so that they don't go home hungry. And this was a stark reality and a really uncomfortable juxtaposition to think about. I also thought about this when I went on hikes through the mountains that are in the middle of Cape Town. Every Cape Townian or visitor of Cape Town reveres them. But through apartheid, they were created as a barrier between the haves and the have-nots, and that still rings true today. So on one side of the mountain, we see the central business district. There's a World Cup stadium, great nightlife, businesses, restaurants. The other side, the sprawling Cape Flats. The further away you get from the mountain, the more impoverished and disadvantaged the communities become. Here's one more image of that inequality and the persistence of apartheid. Here, this is a map showing all the different races of Cape Town. You can see there are pretty definable stark lines between orange and blue, or orange and purple, where purple is white, orange is colored, and blue is black. And so you can see this was taken in 2001, so 15 years past apartheid, and this is still happening and it's still a reality. So at this point, you guys might be thinking like, well, South Africa, like, they've had a hard past, they've got a hard future, a lot of stuff to tackle. But we're really not that different. Take a look at this picture of Cleveland. This is the same kind of map of Cape Town, where green dots represent black people and blue dots represent white people. And then you'll see by Euclid, University Circle, and Case Western Reserve, we are quite diverse, so that's pretty cool for us. But we still have these problems, but how often do we really think about how our world is separate and apart from people who aren't like us? How do we really think about this? How many of us, honestly, have traveled further east than Gas USA or the Little Italy train stop? How many of us are aware that 65% of all Cleveland residents are functionally illiterate, which means that they don't have the reading skills to read a bus table or the math skills to understand their medicine bottle? These are questions that we need to be asking ourselves because the reality of our country and for so many people in it. So finally, I would like to end on these pictures taken just earlier this week at the University of Cape Town. The government decided about a couple weeks ago that they wanted to raise tuition fees at all tertiary institutions, making it, by some accounts, impossible for 95% of the country to afford tertiary education. And students, they took a stand. They decided that this was making education a way out of poverty that we have all agreed upon, financially inaccessible for 95% of the country of South Africa. Students here, you'll see, they were imprisoned, they were tear gassed, there were stun grenades, there was police brutality. But together, they took a stand and they made a change. They said, enough with systemic inequality, enough with institutionalized racism. So I want all of us here to start asking these tough questions about ourselves, really look into our history, be a little bit uncomfortable, and then think about what can we do. And this week, preparing for this speech, I've been really inspired by my classmates back in South Africa, and so I hope you can be too. Thank you.